me because I was always inquisitive as a kid, and I grew up watching people on TV like Brian Gumbel on the Today Show, who I thought was just an excellent broadcaster, was an excellent interviewer. You know, he could handle sports and news with aplomb, and did the Today Show. So I wanted to have a career that made a difference, and he actually made a difference. And I think, not just in broadcasting, but if you see somebody that you want to model yourselves after, whether it's professionally or personally, then you follow them, and hopefully you are inspired by them. And he was one of the people that inspired me. There's a guy named Max Robinson. Anybody remember Max Robinson? Yeah, he inspired me too. So there was all these people who showed me, and again, Jim Vance, when I interned for him, that if they could do it, then I could do it if I was willing to do the work. And here I am.
Yeah,
so
it's working out.
It's so
Working
far
out
so
for you, I
good.
think.
But it's been a blessing.
Don, why did you want to become a journalist?
Just to clarify, so you're not going to New York? Just
If I do, it'll be on retirement.
I was going to say it louder for the people in the back. I got here because as a kid, I was a straight up thief. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Basically, I would beat my dad to the newspaper every morning, and I would steal the newspaper before he could get to it. And before he would notice, I would already be at school, and I would be reading the paper on the bus to school, and I read it at lunchtime and until it was done. That process started with me stealing the sports page out of the paper first. Then I would get to everything else, and I grew up in North Jersey, so I grew about 25 minutes out of New York, and it was the Newark Star-Ledger at the time. Then he would get the USA Today, back when the USA Today was actually a thing, and it wasn't this big. And that's how it started for me. It was just a love for newspapers and reading it. And you do something long enough, all of a sudden you start to realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm like really interested in this. I'm really enjoying this. And then along the way, as I got into high school and beyond, or into college, it just it stuck with me. It's like, maybe this is something you should pursue. So I went to Boston University, and while I was there, I decided to major in broadcast journalism. But I wasn't completely sold out, because everybody told me how difficult journalism in general would be. And I heard all the nightmare stories about starting your career in, like, say, Paducah, Kentucky, and making, like, no money whatsoever. And so I hedged my bets a little bit, and I also got another degree in political science. And so when I graduated, I worked at a law firm for a year in Manhattan, and took the LSAT, and decided I was going to go to Fordham Law School. But while I was working at that law firm, I realized that I was still so obsessed with journalism and sports, and it was just an itch that I had to scratch. So instead of pursuing it right away, I decided to get more serious in terms of education. Went to Northwestern, Medill, shout out. I went to Medill for grad school, and then decided to start my broadcast career. And my first job was in Sarasota, Florida. Like Rick, it was a short stint. I was there for 14 months. After that, I went to St. Louis. I was there for a year and a half. Left there, came to Philly. So each step of the way, I signed contracts that were long. They were like 3 years, but in the contract, my first one, I said, hey, can you give me an out clause for a top 25 market? They're like, sure, kid. No chance you'll be able to get that. You just started, you kind of stink, which was true. Got better quickly and was able to get out. Same with my contract in St. Louis. And then I found myself at KYW here in Philly. So that was a great decision. I'd never spent any real time in Philadelphia, and
Why sports? Did you play sports? Or was
I played sports in high school and stuff, but I had some scholarship opportunities, but I wasn't exactly going to play for the U. You know what I mean? So it was like I took some visitations. Like I went to like Lehigh, and while I was there shadowing some of the football players, I'm like, damn, these guys have no time to study. So unless I'm going pro, I probably really want to dive into the books a little bit. So that's when I decided that you know, the dream of playing football or anything else is probably not one that was going to work out for me. So really lean into journalism at that point.
What do people not understand about sports coverage? There's a lot of assumptions about what your job is.
Yeah, it's not just obviously reading and reacting. When I say reading, I mean like watching a game and then just going out and talking about it. I mean the you know, your same fundamentals that Anne-Marie you use and Rick you use to cover news is the same stuff that we use in sports, right? You do really have to be a reporter first. I think the one thing that differentiates sports coverage is that there's a whole lot of leeway for editorializing along the way, right? Especially in a city like Philadelphia. If the Eagles stink, I can't go out there and just say, well, they lost 40 to 3. Like, this town would not accept that. I have to say that they were hot trash because you expect that from me, and that's okay. Whereas if you're covering an election and, you know, whether you lean blue or red, you can't call it like that. So that is one of the big things that's really important while covering sports. But by and large, the fundamentals are the exact same in terms of, you know, reading, writing, asking good quality, open-ended questions, and being smart with the way that you approach people, and it's a people business.
I always thought of, and I got questions for you.
Okay.
I always thought of sports as particularly challenging because you are covering individuals that you have to build a rapport with.
Yeah.
But you also have to ask them some tough questions.
Yeah, you have to be really critical.
And they're rich.
Oh yeah, and then there's
They
that
don't answer
aspect
your
too.
questions. Yeah.
And they're rich, they have egos. It is, sports definitely is challenging that way, and I think that obviously the game has changed too. Not just, when I say the game, I don't mean the actual literal games, I mean the game of journalism, right? Because now when you interview players and you go about your business, they don't necessarily need you to get the business out, get their word out. Whereas 15 years ago, if Donovan McNabb, while covering him, he had something to tell the viewing public, to tell fans, he wanted to use you as a mouthpiece,
Right.
as a sounding board. These guys, they got Twitter, X, whatever you want to call
With
it.
millions
They
of
got
followers.
IG, they got TikTok. They break their own news. So the game has changed in that regard.
And you know, if we're talking about black men, and you know, to be for real, there weren't many black quarterbacks back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
So, and now there's many of them, and I always appreciated like you and Deuces and this, that you have to kind of, how do you handle that either relationship, even someone like a Stephen A. Smith, where how do you handle the relationship of the black athlete having while at the same time criticizing them, calling them out when they don't perform, or when they do something off the field that might be questionable, because I think the black athletes in some ways expects the black news anchor or the black news reporter to have their back, so to speak, and that could be a kind of a, you know, a tough bridge to cross.
I have been there, and I won't call out players by names. Okay, so yeah, I have been critical of people on our Sunday night show, whatever post-game show, and then the next time you're in the locker room on a Wednesday, I have literally been called out in the locker room like, bruh, let me holler at you real quick. You know, side conversations or like, and I have been face to face with people who are not happy with things that I've said. But at the end of the day, I think that if you are authentic and you're not mean-spirited in the way that you talk about guys, I think that's the most important thing, right? You don't ever want it to be personal, you know? Listen, if you're a quarterback, you go out there and you complete 40% of your passes with 2 picks, you stink, and you know you stink. You're just mad that I said it. And so that's important to understand that, like, you know, to have that conversation with a guy.
But you're a brother, you're supposed to have my back, you know.
Yeah, it's difficult. And I would say this earlier in my career, it was an interesting dynamic because I was the same age as the players.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a whole different kind of situation. Like, you know, when I say the same age, within range, I mean, when I first started, I was younger than a lot of the players. And so I would go out, and I'd be in the same club as Allen. It's Iverson, like it's not like you doing your thing, I'm doing my thing, it's cool as long as nobody don't get arrested, I don't have to talk about it. It's that simple, right? So you build relationships in different ways.
All right, Rick, let me ask you, now seeing as you mentioned the fact that, you know, things are sort of complicated by the fact that you are a black man, right? You're not just journalists.
Nope.
You know, when people turn on the news, and like I said earlier, it is a time of crisis. They are looking for calm and clarity, and they look at you, but you also come with your own journey. How do you particularly over the last few years, when we've had George Floyd and all sorts of stuff, how do you balance, you know, you as a black man, but also you as a journalist? Have you had like conversations in the newsroom about it, about the way some issues have been represented that you don't like, or give us an insight?
Absolutely. You know, there was a story the other day about these teenagers. I think it was in Limerick Township, and these 3 young black teenagers, I think they were 17 years old, and they wanted to get water guns because their last day of school they're going to have a water gun fight. So they go into Target, and apparently they didn't have enough money to buy these water guns, so they shoplifted. And they were caught by security, called police, and there was this chase in Limerick where the police were chasing these 3 teenagers in a car, and the car crashed, and all 3 of them died. This happened a few days ago. So when we learned of the story, you know, okay, it's okay, police chase, ended, crash, and 3 people were killed. So most of the people in my newsroom, this happened in the evenings during my, you know, where we're preparing for my show at 11 o'clock. So most people in my newsroom who are not black were like, okay, well, police chase, you know, they crashed, they died, okay, so that's what we're going to say, that, you know, they were eluding police, and this is what happens when you break the law and the police are chasing. But there was more to the story, and it is I feel it's my responsibility to say, okay, yeah, but maybe they were afraid because they were being chased by police and they didn't know what to do, they were nervous, and yeah, maybe they did break the law, pilfered something from a Target, but these were still 3 black teenagers who were victims in a different type of way. So the reporter who was on the story, you know, I got on the phone with him. I said, "You need to flesh this out a little bit. It wasn't just a police chase, a crash. These are 3 17-year-olds who, for some reason, felt that they needed to get away from police, and this horrible occurrence took place, and just flesh it out. And it wasn't because they were black, or these teenagers were black, although I do feel a certain responsibility for when stories like that happen, but it also is because there's not a lot of empathy in newsrooms, in my newsroom across the country. You know, when crime happens, when unfortunate stories happen, there are more than just the victims of the crime. You know, there's the people who loved the people who were arrested, there's people who love the victims. So I just try to make sure that we're telling the truth, but giving all the facts and not just the headlines, 3 teenagers killed in a car crash as they were leaving police. So, and there's not always time for that, but as a black man, who at 11 o'clock, I do have a lot of editorial content, say, than I do at 5 o'clock, or any other show I've done since I've been at 6 ABC. But I do feel that it's my responsibility to not just tell the truth, but also to provide some type of
I think nuance,
The
right?
nuance.
Like nuance is really important,
Exactly.
especially when it involves race.
Yes.
And I think that's where we play really critical roles in the newsroom, as oftentimes being the only person or one of just a handful of black people around.
Exactly. So it's just not as cut and dry as we sometimes report it, and sometimes we don't have a lot of time to report more than just, but as a black man in the media, I try to at least go a little deeper and find out, you know, what were some of the particulars that was more than just a young black man getting arrested, or a young black man dying in a car crash, and in a perfect world, I'd be able to provide all of that type of nuance, if possible, but sometimes you can't. But I always try to be committed to getting a little deeper than what we just reported.
You just said in a perfect world. Yeah, if you've seen sort of the latest statistics about having trust in media, you know that the trust has been diminishing, and some people are choosing to get their news from all kinds of other sort of platforms. And I've had people in my own family say, well, you guys lied about X, Y, Z. And I've had to explain to them, how the newsroom works and how decisions are made, and how sometimes you have some information and then later on it changes because you have additional information. I think the question that I want to ask is, what do people need to know about how these news decisions are being made? And who's in the newsroom making these decisions?
Yeah, and I tell people all the time, don't let Action News or KYW, don't let that be your only form of information that you rely on. And there's obviously a lot of different outlets that people can look for information. Sometimes, it's in a bubble that you're only looking at the news outlet that prescribes to your own personal viewpoints. But I always try, especially young people, the young journalists, don't let a TV station or a newspaper or radio be your only source of information. Because, again, in my newsroom, there were mostly white people. There were mostly people, and they try to be as expansive in their thoughts as possible. But at the end of the day, a newscast is 22 minutes without commercials, and we're not going to be able to provide every factoid that we can. So let the TV stations be maybe your first line of information, but then go deeper, especially since you can go online and you can, you have so many. When I was coming up, I had an encyclopedia that I had to go to the library. But now you go on your phone and right, exactly. So you remember we go to Howard Library, and so now information is just like that. So don't let just one source be your single source of information before you make a thorough judgment or decision on a particular news story.
Guys, I don't know if you agree. I suspect that you will. Man, it's hard. This business is not easy. It looks glamorous. I mean, I watch Rick. He looks glamorous. But it is, the guy looks great. But no, seriously, it is difficult because newsrooms are shrinking, resources are shrinking steadily. And so when you sit in a newsroom and you get ready for an 11 o'clock show, there's not this cast of thousands making these decisions and putting together these shows. It's amazing that the shows look the way they do with the resources that we ultimately have. And so all that to say is, a lot of times you're looking at a producer, an executive producer, your news anchor, maybe one other person.
Maybe a writer
who's involved. So you're talking maybe under 5 people making maybe an awfully critical decision. And then a lot of times, what I'll see in our newsroom is that, the nuance that is required, sometimes at that particular time for that show, the people who would offer that kind of nuance aren't working that shift, maybe not around. You get people talking about real specific city issues, and they live in a burb somewhere, have lived in the burbs their entire lives. So they don't know. And sometimes they make mistakes, and it's not necessarily intentional, I want this to be a slanted angle. It's just that we are all human, and sometimes people are coming at it from an angle in which they can't help. That's why I think diversity is obviously super important in the newsroom, not just along race, but also ages and sex and where you live in order to make these ultimate decisions.
That's because we do have a lot of people in our newsroom who know nothing really about the city of Philadelphia. Like if some type of crime happens or incident happens near Temple University, I say, oh, well, it was, it was in the hood, so it must have been, well, Temple University is more than just North Philadelphia. It's more than just, the Badlands of Philadelphia. So it is up to us to find out, by asking police or making phone calls, was this really just a case of, someone who was shot because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was it drug deal? Just because it happened at Temple University does not mean it was, just a stick up or a mugging or whatever. And again, because we have people who are covering these parts of Philadelphia without ever really having lived in that part of Philadelphia.
Or lived a long time ago,
right.
20 years ago. So
Yeah.
that's what they think of.
Yes.
They feel Fishtown is one thing, and Fishtown is
Right.
a completely different
The
neighborhood.
judgment
Yeah.
is skewed a little bit, and and that's where it's our responsibility as journalists to make sure that that we provide as much facts and as much truth and as much fairness as possible, regardless of the geographics of the city or where a certain news story took place. Like we said, a lot of our coworkers, a lot of our colleagues live in Bucks County and in Delaware County, but they're covering situations that happen in North Philadelphia, University City, Fishtown, and their frame of reference is only what they hear from a police blotter or what they hear from reporters who are out there, instead of really the Doomsday Festival is tomorrow. We're reporting it, and one of my producers was like, well, is that really something that's a big deal? I said, a Doomsday? I said, well, how long have you been in Philadelphia? Yes, it's a big deal, and maybe because you've never been, and maybe you don't really know how to pronounce it, but that is one of the
You're on your way to the shore.
That is one of the one of the biggest events in the Black community, and it's just
in
not
the country, by the way.
in the country, and
Yes.
it's just, and you don't go just because you're Black. You go because it's a cultural event, and you go because it's a coming together, and Philadelphia needs as many coming together events as possible of all diversity. We're up against an administration, I'm trying not to get political, that doesn't want diversity. But this is a Doomsday will bring so many people together, and I told our assignment there, I said, make sure we cover it. Make sure we give it the credence it deserves, and shows that this is something that makes Philadelphia special. And whoever reports, make sure they say it right.
That too.
But again, with people who don't have that frame of reference, so it's up to me who's been here forever to tell them, the Doomsday is a big deal, and we should definitely cover it, and we should make sure it gives it the credence that it deserves.
One more thing about the Anne-Marie, there's a lot of young people in here, people maybe aspiring to be journalists or people, whatever, right? One thing I want to point out is there's this cliche, don't sweat the details. No, sweat all the details. You find those details, sweat them. It's very important because that's the difference between making that mistake about a due day and not.
Yeah, I'm you're making me recall a story, Trayvon Martin. When the incident happened with Trayvon Martin and there were protests sparking up around the country, there was one being organized in Philadelphia, and I remember sitting in that editorial meeting saying, I think this is a big deal. We have similar laws, stand your ground laws here in Pennsylvania. I think we need to dig into this. There's going to be a protest today. It's a big deal. And I could not convince the decision maker, who's no longer there, that it was a big deal. And it wasn't until the protest, which took over downtown, that they sort of woke up and realized, oh yeah, it's happening here, it's happening in Florida, it's happening in DC, this is a movement. But when you're just one of a handful of voices, sometimes it's hard for them to understand communities that they're not tapped into,
Exactly.
So, that being said, you mentioned it is a business. News is still a business, right? And I kind of, it's